So I'm going to start by saying what I'm going to do, and then I'll go through that. And I'm going to talk about the educational systems and the information in it and the structures in it to begin with. So I'll look at the kinds of things that we could be monitoring, should be monitoring in our schools, and then at the structure of education, the hierarchical nature of it, and say something about that hierarchical nature of the schools. And I'm going to just mention a theory that I have around that, which hopefully lets the data hang on it. And then within assessment, we often talk about feedback to the student, feedback to the teachers, feedback to the schools, and that's a mechanism designed to improve the system. So I want to say something about that feedback, both its promise and the complexity surrounding it. And then I'm going to pick a case study from England because that's had enormous educational reforms attached to it. And so I just want to recount some of the issues surrounding that since those big reforms started and a diagnosis of some of the issues that came from it and what we can learn from that and from the hypotheses. And also, if we want to change, and my goodness, there's change going on in Kazakhstan and NIS and everything else. If we want to change people's behavior, if we want to change the way that a teacher teaches, for example, what do we have to do that? And personal ways forward. Okay, maybe you can see a little bit of that. At least 3 of us here have been to Durham. This is the cathedral, yes, so this is built 900 years old. It's a World Heritage Site, and the university is just off to the side there. So if you've got any chance, please come to Durham. We'd be pleased to see you there. Okay, so I'm going to say what in education, what is important? What should we monitor? What should we assess as we track children through? What things do we hope to influence? And I'm going to put this in an ABC list because it's easier to remember. So A here, the first one, is the affective part. That is to say, what the students are feeling about what's going on. Are they enjoying their life? Are they looking forward to it? So the affective part. Secondly, on the behavioral part, are they becoming members of society by being members of the school? Are they law-abiding? Are they impulsive? Do they obey laws? Do they disobey them when it's appropriate? What's the behavior like? C is the cognitive part. That's the thinking part, and that means the learning that we do in mathematics or language or reading or history. So that's mainly the bit that we do concentrate on, but it's only one of a great big list. Then we come to D, the demographics, so the home background of the children. What background do they come from? What is their first language? What ethnicity perhaps? How they moved around there. Then E will be the expenditure in the system. How much are we spending on this? I noted that NIS schools, the teachers get paid twice as much as those in the other schools in Kazakhstan. Well, that's an interesting thing to bear in mind. Do you get twice the productivity as a result of paying twice the money? I don't know the answer to that, but at least we need to track it, we need to monitor it, we need to know it in order to pick those forwards. Then the flow in the system. Who's coming into this system? How many are going to university? How many are dropping out? How many are moving to another thing? So we need to know the flow of people within that system and how much individuals grow. How do they grow cognitively? How do they grow physically? How do they grow mentally? How do they generate as time goes on? And that kind of growth curves that we see, some interesting research recently that suggests that cognitive growth parallels physical growth, so that as young children grow steadily during primary school and then they suddenly shoot away in height around puberty and then flatten off, so our cognitive abilities also grow steadily and then suddenly shoot away and then flatten off later on. Okay. Now I thought we'd look at the structures within the educational system, because those structures provide a kind of background against which we can think about education. And if we just think to begin with about pupils, then those pupils are sitting in classes, and those classes, of course, are within schools, and the schools within districts, and the districts perhaps within states if they're large countries. I'm not sure of the structure here, and those states themselves within countries. And we can think, of course, a pupil might move from one class to another class, but generally they'll stay in one school for quite a long time. Some might move to another state, even to another country, although that's a little bit unusual. And some countries might have more movement within it than others. But within this system, I then have a kind of challenge for you for what matters most. If you think about the progress that children make, say in mathematics, say in learning a language, say in reading, does it matter most which country they are being educated in? What difference does that make to them? Does it matter which district within a country? What about which school they're in? What about who the teacher is? What about which the pupil is? I want you in your mind, please, just to think which are the most important, which are the least important. Is there anything there that really doesn't matter? And if you were just to have your own children, where would you want them to go? Which country? Did that matter? Which school? Which teacher? What would you choose most? I'm going to quantify this. Okay, and I'm going to begin with what's called a box and whisker plot. Are you familiar with such plots? Okay, this is a box and whisker plot. I wonder if this has got a... Okay. So in this box and whisker plot, I'm showing here up the left-hand side a scale of attainment. In fact, I think this is for reading, but it could be anything and it could be anywhere. So the scale is from very low attainers to very high. And these are of pupils. Actually, it's of 600,000 children in England. And they go into schools there. And the highest point, that little bit at the top, is the highest score. And it goes down to the lowest score. The little line in the middle is the middle score, the median score, the 50th percentile. And the box holds half the children. So the box goes from the 75th percentile to the 25th. And this is called a box and whisker plot. And it's a nice way to show data if you want to show data very quickly. Now I'm going to put on the same chart the box and whisker plot, not for the pupils, but for the schools. So I'll take the average score for each school and show the box and whisker plot for them. You might just try to think, what will it look like when I show it? Well, the average stays the same. But the highest, of course, isn't as high as the pupils because it's the average of many pupils. So the highest is much lower than the average. So there's much less spread. But still, if you were to say, well, where would you be? It would matter which school you went to. You get high scores, you get low scores, you get high achieving schools and low achieving schools. Now, what if we look at the districts? By the way, there's about 20,000 schools in that. Now, if I look at the number of districts, and there's about 100 districts, what do their plots look like? And of course, the districts are the averages of the schools in the districts. Okay, so what will the chart look like? Well, it's much less. It's much less. The average is still the same, but now the highest score is the highest of the average schools. So does it matter which district you go to? It matters a little bit. Okay. But here, I'm just looking at the attainment levels. And we really shouldn't judge the educational system by the attainment levels, but instead by the progress that people make in the attainment level. How good is the teacher? Not according to the level of the children, but according to the progress that the children have made with that teacher. Okay, so we need to know about progress. And that I'm going to call value added. Now, I want to look at the value added of these same children. And if they took at the value added of the students, how much progress did they make? Then if we look at the students, then that's their value added score. If we look at the schools, that's their value added score. So it matters which school you go to. If I look at the districts, it doesn't matter. So I know in various countries, I don't know about Kazakhstan, I know in various countries that the district is not important, but the school is relevant. And actually, the individual children are pretty important as well. One child can do very well in what we normally regard as a bad school, and a pupil can do badly in what we would normally regard as a good school. No, I didn't, because I didn't have it in that particular data. It's hard to do, and that's a good point, and I'm going to put up some figures about the teacher now. Sometimes it's hard to pin down a teacher because when a pupil, they'll go from one teacher to another teacher and back again. So in the research literature, you will find a lot about school effects, but you'll find much less about teacher effects. But I believe them to be much bigger than the school effects, where you have the data. A pupil can still do well or badly despite the teacher. Yeah. Still possible. So for a pupil, if we look at how much of the variance is associated with their prior scores, 50% of the variance of a pupil's scores is associated with their prior scores. So I'm quantifying how much importance of an individual is. So if we know where a child starts, we know a lot about where they're likely to finish at the end. Correlation 0.7, square 0.7, you get about half, 50% of the variance. If we look at the teachers, then typically up to 40% of the variance, so nearly as important as the individual pupil, but it varies according to the study. Okay, so some studies that might go down to, I don't know, 15%, but some up to 40%, and it varies quite a lot, but it's always a high figure. Schools, well, they sometimes get up to 30%, but they're normally more like 10%, 10 to 12%. Districts, about 1% or less. But here's the bizarre thing. As you see, as we're moving away from the child, they become less important. The closer we are to the child, the more important. The further we go away. So if you think about a child in a school, they're working with their teacher. The head is a little bit more distant. The person sitting in the district office is miles away and not really relevant. It's that person in the classroom with the teacher. That's the one. So the proximate variables, the close variables are the ones that matter. But bizarrely, this country does matter. And in all those international studies, and they don't have value-added scores. They don't have prior measures. So they can't look at progress. So Tymms, Pearls, PISA, maybe some of you studied those or thinking about those. They don't have progress measures. They've only got home background measures, and they're not good enough for the research. So many claims are made about the international studies which are not warranted because they're assumed to show the impact of the educational system, but actually they don't have prior measures. But anyway, what evidence we do have suggests that the countries are important. So I can put that in a graph here, suggesting that the individual pupil, the individual is most important, next the teacher, next the school, next the district, and then bizarrely, the jurisdiction, the country is important as well. So a child who would be born in Malawi or born in Finland, we can be pretty sure that the child born in Finland is going to do better in reading than the child born in Malawi. Yeah, pretty sure. Whatever the teacher, whatever the school, that matters in the long run. So I'm going to call this PVC theory. So I'm going to call that proximate variables within a culture. So more proximate, and that's a general feature of educational work, that proximate variables dominate. The ones that are closest dominate, but actually, bizarrely, it matters within which culture you are. Okay. So I'm saying that the salient features, the ones that are closest. So we would predict that for a child, not only the teacher, but the parent also. And not only the parent, but maybe the other children in the class, maybe they're also important. The things that are close, the things that matter to them. Sometimes it might be an uncle, sometimes it may be a brother. Okay, that's too little to see. Okay, and it's within the prevailing culture. So the culture be important. Of course, for the student, if you're thinking about proximate variables and why they're important, they're proximate to themselves, in a sense. So feedback, let me just say, of course, feedback is where you take, say, a test result and you give it back to the students. Or in a university, we've got students' ratings of their lecturers, and we give the lecturer the students' ratings. Or we give the feedback from PISA to the governments. So the idea is always that the feedback is going to be positive, and that's a major mechanism, not the only mechanism, but that's seen to be a major mechanism for improvement of educational systems. And probably the most famous paper about that, or summary of that, is Inside the Black Box, a paper by Paul Black and Dylan William. Do you know about that piece of work, Inside the Black Box? Do you know about it? Okay, so I'll start by telling you something about it. Let's imagine that you have, as a teacher, you've given your class some work to do. It's an essay. It's a piece of work on chemistry. It's some mathematics. Okay, so you give them all the work, then you give them a test, and you collect the test back in, and then you mark the tests, and then you give the test back, but to 1/3 of the class, picked at random, you give back the test papers with a score or a mark on it. It says 40%, or it says B, or it says 2-1. It gives a grade, 1/3. To another third, you don't give the grade, you only give advice on how to get better. You say, you were writing this essay, and in this paragraph, I think you could reorganize your sentences, or maybe this spelling could be improved, or whatever else. You give advice on how to get better, another third. To another third, you give back papers which have the grade and the advice. Right. Now, you now teach a bit more and give them another test. What difference did your feedback make to those students? Well, what I've described has been done not once, but it's been done many times. And Black and William have looked at that research, and they conclude that if you give back a grade, the work does not improve. Right? The grade alone does not help the student. If you give back only feedback on how to get better, then the next work will be better. The students have learned from it. But the really surprising bit from their piece of work is that if you give feedback and you give the grade, it is as though you did not give feedback. The grade prevents the learning from the feedback. Now, I tell you this as somebody who's 65 years old and started teaching when I was early 20s, and I have always given grades. Okay. Even to master students at the university, or even to the PhD students, they want to know, do you think it's going to pass? And I tell them, yes, it's going to pass. Or no, I'm giving feedback, but I know that the research is against that. So this piece of work, Black and William, called Inside the Black Box, is certainly worth looking at if you are a teacher, if you want to learn how to get better. And it's a tough message. It's a tough message. And actually, teachers find it quite difficult to mark work and not to give feedback. And even some students will be demanding the grade. Yeah. So there's a kind of double edge to this sword. But I think it's important work, and it's been important in its feedback. Okay. Herb Marsh claims that our own personal self-esteem, we within our own brains compare our mathematics with our language. So that if we feel good about our mathematics, our language esteem goes down, and vice versa. Okay? So people tend to think that people are always good at language, always good at mathematics. Actually, they tend to go together. And there is a little bit of experimental evidence in favor of this theory. In one experiment, people were deliberately given a maths test and then given scores back, but they were deliberately given low scores. They found their language self-esteem went up because the maths went down. So it's an internal comparison. You might wonder about the ethics of that experiment, but anyway, it was done a little while ago, and people were debriefed on it later. Okay, so feedback. Let's just come back to that. So feedback is important, and formative feedback, not grades, is the way to get people to learn things. People need to know how to get better, and grades don't tell them that, is the message from that. But in the meta-analysis, a meta-analysis is where you bring a whole series of different investigations together, right? So you've taken a lot of different things, so that meta-analyses produce an average effect size which is very high. That's 0.7. Have you come across effect sizes? Do you know about effect sizes? No? Okay. So if you know, sometimes you would look at scores on a measure. So you would look at scores on a measure of self-esteem or maths or whatever, and you'd often get a normal distribution. So you have a mean and a standard deviation, and the effect size is how many standard deviations the other group is better than the first group. Okay? So an effect size of 0.7 means that the group who got the feedback were 0.7 of a standard deviation better than the group who didn't get the feedback. Right? That's 0.7. But, and here's the point I want to make, that in that meta-analysis, the variation in the experiments was also very big. In other words, some of them with the feedback got very positive results, and some didn't get nearly so positive results. In fact, some have actually had negative results. So by giving feedback without the grade, it actually on occasions has had a bad effect. So it isn't a consistent thing. If you do it, you're not guaranteed success. It varies. And that's true of everything in education, of course, that you're not guaranteed success in it. Okay. And I just mentioned that in Scotland, the whole country moved itself to what's called assessment for learning, where they got the whole country to move in that direction. And if you looked at an evaluation of that whole country, you would not find that their attainment levels have shifted dramatically, as people had hoped it would. Okay. Another key person in this game of looking to what makes a difference is a guy called John Hattie, original New Zealander, then spent some time in the United States, then went back to New Zealand, is now in Australia. And he'd done a lot of meta-analyses and advice on what seems to work in schools. And in his work, he did 12 meta-analysis feedbacks, and again, he gets a high effect size, slightly different from the one from Black and William, but 0.79, so a very similar effect. And he puts it as one of the top influences on achievement. So if you want people to get better, it's feedback that matters. And that's true not just of education and learning things, it's also true, for example, of sports. It's also true of communication. It's also true of playing chess. It's feedback that matters. And if you try to learn something and you don't have a feedback loop in it, then you probably won't learn it. You must have feedback loops. And it's manipulating the feedback loops that matter. But it also produced an analysis of the feedback loops and shows that it's not just a question of getting feedback. And he noted that it's possible to give feedback. You can easily give feedback which is negative. And somebody doesn't do very well. And of course we would say, well, okay, maybe you'd like to try this. Or an alternative from some teachers, well, that's rubbish. You know? And that kind of negative feedback can have a long-term impact on people. And some people can remember back to the occasion when something like that happened to them in their youth. And it was often, surprisingly, in mathematics where it's happened. He says that when your feedback comes back, it says, where are you going? That might be feedback. How are you progressing? And where are you going to next? And there's I won't go into that now, but there's a long article and worth reading if you're interested in feedback loops. So remember that hierarchy that I had, and the hierarchy which had the pupils in classes and the classes in schools and the schools. So what about the other levels? That's the feedback loop that goes to the pupil. But what about the feedback that goes to the teacher? Okay, so we might be giving the teachers the school's children's average results back, or we might be giving university lecturers students' feedback. What does the research say about feedback at the level of the teacher or the lecturer? Well, there have been a number of investigations of that, and there's a particular paper by Cohen and another one by Penny and Co. And that looked at, if you just take students' feedback, so I'm sure you fill in feedback about your lessons, do you? You fill it, yeah, you fill it. And they go to your lecturers, yes, and then your lecturers change. Okay. So does that feedback make any difference? Well, in the experiments where faculty have been given the feedback or not given the feedback, and then you look next year, it makes very little difference. Just the feedback alone makes a little difference. 0.2 is the effect size. That's 0.2 is a tiny shift, but it's a positive shift. So teachers who are told, oh, you're great or you're not so good, it makes a small difference. But people have tried to improve that by working on that feedback. And the one that seems to have worked best is to get the lecturer to sit down and talk about the feedback with an experienced other member of faculty. Okay. And if that's done, then that effect size can get up to 0.7. Whoops, let me just come. So I think what's happening is this, that if we take a teacher Teachers want to do a good job. They want their students to learn. They want to be appreciated. When they get bad feedback, they feel bad about it. They want to be doing better. But often, they won't actually know about it or how to get better. Maybe they're given some advice on the feedback sheets, and that would be important. But if you take somebody who's experienced as a lecturer, and they've seen different things, they've read different things, they've maybe watched the lectures this person's giving, and then they hear the feedback, they say, you might like to try this, or you might like to do this, or how about changing that? It's that advice on how to get better, not just are you good, are you bad, but how to get better, which really matters. Okay, I'm going to shift, and I want to look at a case study from England, at the way in which things have moved. England has had massive efforts to improve its standards of education. I really mean absolutely massive efforts. So, for example, there was a national curriculum. There was not a national curriculum in 1980, but a national curriculum was introduced. And then we had national testing. We didn't have national testing except at the age of 16. Then we put it in for children aged 7, 11, 13, and so on. Then we had an inspection system that was put in that could hold people to account. If an inspector says the school is not good, that school's in real trouble. So they had power and money, clout. Then we had initiatives, hundreds of initiatives to do with basic skills. I see similar kinds of things in Kazakhstan in the extent of the interventions and the innovations. Probably more in Kazakhstan than in England. But nevertheless, for England, these were massive changes, and so on. The money that was spent is also absolutely enormous. I don't have this in translated amounts of money, but this is in pounds. So that's the inspection system cost £100 million a year. Are you able to tell me how much that would be if you translated it to here?
$1 billion.
How much? 52 billion in the amount of money here per year. And we're a smallish country. You know, it's not that big. This is only England. This isn't even the whole of Great Britain. That's every year they're spending this kind of money. Or I took the National Numeracy Strategy, it cost £500 million. Or the National Literacy Strategy, a similar amount of money. Or if we took national testing, per pupil, per test, it cost £40 per pupil per test. And they did at least 3 tests, and they were doing the age of 7, 11, and 14. And there are 600,000 children in 1 year. Right? So we're talking about a lot of money here. So did it work? 25 billion. Okay, thank you. We've got that big, you know, the number of noughts hardly matters, yeah. Okay, I'm going to look at the test scores for those children, and you can see here that between 1995, when all of that stuff started to kick in, and then over the years, up to 2000, the test scores, the percentage of children who were reaching a particular level was rising year on year on year on year. But I think that these data tell us a bogus story. I think there's something wrong with it. And if you look at those 2 figures, those graphs, maybe you can even see that there's something a bit fishy about it. The 2 things that I would point to are, first of all, that it appears to rise and stop abruptly. It shouldn't do that. If we introduce a way that improves things, I would expect it to rise steeply and then to gradually flatten off. It would plateau, not up like that. And secondly, I would expect initiatives to have more of an effect on English than maths, or maths than English. I wouldn't expect the effect to be the same in both cases. But if you look at the difference here between maths and English, although it's gone through little things, by the time you got to the end, they're identical. So there's something wrong with the data. In fact, I would expect in England that schools have a bigger effect on mathematics than they do on reading, because reading is more dependent on home background and other things, whereas the maths is almost all taught at school. Well, I was able to collect data, and I needn't go through it, from lots of different sources to independent sources on that. and therefore collected data from many different studies and many different assessments over that period, and was able to show that actually those data really are wrong, and that what really happened was that actually the English rose very slightly. So about 48% were getting the level, up to about 50%. And that rise is approximately equivalent to the rise that you get from just practicing a test. If you practice a test, you get better at it. So that rise is equivalent to that. The maths test really went up, but didn't go up much, went up a little bit. Okay, what to focus on? I'm going to put 3 things to improve education systems. 1, get good teachers in the schools. That's the absolute #1 thing. Get good. How do you do it? Well, I don't really know. But you must have high status, and if you can do something to maintain the status of teachers in the schools, that's better. There's at least 1 country in the Middle East where I know that the status, no men really go in to be teachers unless they're absolutely the bottom of the pile. Not true of women, but it is not true of men. The status of teaching generally has dropped across the Western world, perhaps as other jobs become available. As we hit recession and bad times, we get better people to be teachers because they can't get jobs in the banks or whatever else. So anyway, we need the status to be high. Some countries where the status is very high include countries 50 years ago. The word for a teacher in India is rather nice. It's a guru. And the children are taught to respect gurus and also parents at the early stage. Or you'd find the status of the teachers very high in some, and then it's kind of gone down over time. And hopefully it'll come up. It's very high in Finland, that come top of the league tables, for example. Recruit the best ones. Find ways to select them. It's not easy to select a good teacher from applicants, and we need to find better ways to do that. And training. I've got the wrong spelling there. Tracing, it says, should be training. If we're going to put policies, we must try them out beforehand. We must trial them and get evidence for their working. And once you put them in, you do need to monitor to check that things are working, because we can't guarantee it. The feedback that I talked about, remember, sometimes had a negative impact as well as a positive impact. And that's all I've got to say. Thank you very much.